Welcome everyone to our Cafe Speaker Series talk, Close Distance Scales of Analysis in Digital Projects. I'm Travis Wagner. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Archival Futures, and I'm really excited to have you here today. The Center of Archival Futures, or CAFE as many of us know it, was established in 2021 as a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the iSchool and beyond, whose work intersects at archives and digital curation, but that is a very broadly conceived concept here. We are interested in the systems, processes, and institutions that care for and enable the use of digital objects and data over time. The various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics, including data, communities, knowledge ecosystems, and the life cycles of data. The speaker series is our flagship event. It's normally held on the first Wednesdays of each month during the semester, and we host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation research and practice in a wide variety of institutions. You can find recordings of our previous illustrious guest speakers at our CAFE event page, which I think will be posted multiple times throughout the speaker series. And I do want to call your attention to two of our upcoming talks. On November 2nd, we will have Telling New Stories, Data Papers in the Humanities, and that'll be at 12 p.m. You'll get information about that, or we'll tell you how to get information about that. And then we have another talk coming up on December 7th. Loren Spears will be talking about creating indigenous organizational systems at the Tamaquaque Museum, and that should be really exciting as well. And before I turn things over to Victoria to introduce our speaker, I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So today we're beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway and Nacoshatonk people and then their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge as a land-grant university the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act of 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which included archival collecting, generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resistance or resilience of indigenous communities and nations and celebrate the collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in our collections and institutions. And with that, I will happily turn it over to Dr. Victoria Van Heining to introduce our speaker tonight.
Hi, folks. Welcome, welcome. I am so excited for CAFE to be welcoming Ruth Ahnert, a professor of literary history and digital humanities at Queen Mary University of London. She's a principal investigator on the flagship project Living with Machines at the Alan Turing Institute. She gained her PhD from the Department of English at the University of Cambridge, but more recently her work is focused on the intersection between literary history and data science. She's had fellowships and grants funded by the AHRC, which is the main funding body in the UK, Stanford Humanities Center, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the National Endowment of the Humanities, and I know that there are actually quite a few more on that list. I've been a follower and fan of Ruth's work for many years, and I still remember I once had to miss a talk because I was not well one autumn, and it was a very rainy day in Oxford, so I feel like this is making up for that lost time. And without further ado, over to you, Ruth. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's lovely to be speaking to an audience like this who sort of so closely align with my work. So are you seeing the correct screen this time?
Yes, we are. It looks great.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. In the next 40 minutes, I want to think through what working on digital projects means in terms of interdisciplinary practice. So how do we shift between humanistic and scientific modes of epistemology? What are the affordances and challenges of different scales of data? And how does that change how we tackle it, whether we rely on human reading or machine-driven approaches? And more importantly, how do we practically enact those shifts in scale and approach? And what are the outcomes and payoff for different members of an interdisciplinary team? So to think about this, I want to use an analogy from my recent co-authored book, The Network Turn. So the argument here is that those shifts are a little bit like the use of aerial photography in the field of archaeology. So the aerial photograph reveals those sort of large-scale patterns which are analogous to that most distant kind of reading. We then might select a particular altitude, which is analogous to particular technologies or different kind of algorithms you might choose, which allow us to identify local commonalities. That might then tell you where you want to do your local excavation, to do your dig. You might then find something that tells you to iterate. You might choose a different kind, a different altitude or a different land region at which to repeat this, and you iterate better questions and better methods in the process. So this is, in archaeology, it enabled the discovery of previously unknown archaeological sites, so the equivalent of new case studies in the humanities, but it also makes sense of known prehistoric landscape features, recontextualizing known phenomena. So that's the kind of framework I want to use today. And the need of such a scalable and iterative approach is demonstrated in different ways by thinking about projects at different scales. And so I'm going to give examples from 3 projects I've worked on over the last few years. And as you can see from the outlines here, the first project, Tudor Networks of Power, created and analysed a fairly large data set from a single digitised source. The second, Networking Archives, was a little more than 3 times larger, but added complexity by drawing its data from multiple projects and catalogues. And then the third is a different prospect altogether, because it's a different order of magnitude, dealing with large and much more heterogeneous data, including newspapers, census returns, maps, book corpora, etc. So, Tudor Networks of Power. I want to thank, firstly, the people I did this work with. So my main collaborator on this was actually my husband. And we also worked for a bit with Lotta Vickers and Josie Cree, who did some amazing data preparation for us and geocoding. And we also did a collaboration with Kim Albrecht, who did the visualization you're going to see in a moment. He's a really fantastic knowledge designer. So this project, the aim was to apply methods from the field of quantitative network analysis to the study of early modern letters. And we began by looking at the state papers. So state papers are documents or files kept by a government to record discussions, options, or decisions by government officials, departments, or servants. In this case, we're working with a data set that underlies the resource State Papers Online, which is owned by Gale Cengage, and they provided us with the underlying data from that, thanks to the text and data mining copyright exception, which is a law in the UK. So the data we extracted from this, we extracted the material that was letters in the state papers. So that's over 130,000 items, involving over 20,000 people and spread across Europe and beyond. And with that, the aim of the project was to create a newly curated data set that we're going to publicly release, articles, a book which is coming out next summer, and a code repo and an interactive visualization. So returning to our aerial archaeology metaphor, what might an aerial overview of such a data set look like? So through our collaboration with Kim Albrecht, we produced an interactive visualization that you can see here. So the front page is a kind of macro view involving anybody who's corresponded with 2 or more people. And from that view that you're seeing right now, you can already kind of see those contours with that distribution over time. The big kind of bulges you see actually correlate with the periods of Thomas Cromwell in office, those of you who know the Mantell books, and also Lord Burleigh in that second half. So it kind of already tells you something about the shape of the archive. From that, you're able to navigate to a single person view, or you can look at their material either chronologically or geographically. You can then select an individual piece of correspondence from that and read a description from it. This is then a digital aid to discovery, but not a digital analysis per se. To begin to analyze large-scale patterns, we decided to begin by just sorting it using really standard off-the-shelf network analysis metrics. So what you're seeing here is a distribution of the degree of all people who wrote in the different reigns of the Tudor period: Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth. Now, the degree is kind of a proxy for the number of people that a person corresponded with. And what we have charted here on a logarithmic scale, so it's going up by a factor of 10 each time, are the number of connections each person had. So if you look at that diagonal line on each of the graphs. The dot in the top left corner are the very large number of people who corresponded with hardly anybody. In fact, 66 to 68% of people for every reign corresponded with just one person. Now we have a fairly diagonal line which shows that the vast majority of people corresponded with few people, but a few outliers. The dot at the bottom right-hand corner of each of the diagonal lines are those outliers who corresponded with a disproportionately large number of people. So in the Henry VIII graph, in the top left corner, he is the outlier in the bottom right of that graph with a degree of 2,149. And this graph reveals how rare correspondence hubs are in this particular archive. In Henry's reign, only 17 people have a degree of more than 100. And that's just 0.3% of all people in that reign. So this very distant view shows us how the entire archive is in fact dominated by a very small number of correspondence hubs. The vast majority of people correspond with very few people. It's dominated by the monarchs and their principal secretaries. And this is a vital framing context when considering our local findings. So measuring the number of correspondence connections only tells us so much. However, comparing different metrics allow us to see local commonalities. So what we're graphing here is a comparison of two standard network metrics. So we've got degree, that kind of unique number of connections, which is charted against something called betweenness centrality. Now, we can think about betweenness centrality as a kind of infrastructure measure. So in the UK, I always talk about like the rail infrastructure, that London is like a network hub. But if you're going to take a train journey across the UK, you're almost certainly going to need to go through London because almost all of the rail network connections go through London. But it therefore is kind of an infrastructural hub. But some places are also kind of bridging structures. So we have, of course, one train line that goes under the channel and connects us with France. And that also has very high betweenness because it's the only way of getting from one kind of landmass to another. So it's an infrastructural measure that shows the kind of connectedness of communities. It's a way of creating short paths through a network. So we wanted to know the people who have a very high number of connections, a relatively low number of connections, but a very high bridging function to see if they have infrastructural significance. And what we saw was that when we looked at these for different decades, we started to see patterns. We started to see people with different attributes. So we're interested in people who are below the trend line here. So we noticed that these people have a very high bridging function despite a low number of actual connections. And what we see is they are foreign diplomats known to be involved in espionage, like Bernardino de Mendoza, Catholic conspirators, such as Paget and Morgan, and double agents, such as Anthony Standen, who you see up there. And we thought this was interesting, that these outliers are all a similar kind of people involved in espionage and a conspiracy. And this insight that just two metrics could start to detect shared attributes led us to develop a method that finds individuals with a similar network fingerprint. So using the interface here, it's a kind of ugly internal project interface. We can start, we've got this method where you can start with a person. So here we start with a person called Pietro Bizzari, who was a really interesting guy. He was a historian who traveled from England to the continent to oversee the publication of his writings. But while he was there, he began sending back hundreds of intelligence reports to the secretaries of state. And essentially, he was receiving a pension from the secretaries of state to be an intelligencer, to be a kind of informant, spy for the government. So what kinds of people are like this historian intelligencer? So the people in the top 15 spots most similar to him in terms of their network fingerprint includes military leaders, It includes men in the service of diplomats, so they're kind of personal secretaries and other servants. And then a very heterogeneous group, including agents, priests, and merchants. We wanted to know, do they have anything in common? So an excavation of the contents of the material form of the letters shows us that 14 of the 15 most similar figures to Bizzari also sent regular intelligence reports to the Tudor government. So Palmer, whose letter is shown here, was a priest and double agent located mainly in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, and he sent intelligence reports back on the Spanish affairs. Lee was an agent in Antwerp who seems to have been posted first in a military capacity and sent reports on the activities of Catholic exiles. And then there were two merchants, Stallinge and Stokes, who used their position in ports to pass back the news items that arrived with ships. So Stokes provided intelligence reports from Bruges, and located at Plymouth Haven, Stallinge collected intelligence from Brittany, Spain, and Portugal. So what we see is that a close reading of these letters allows us to see that despite very different professions, these men fulfilled a very similar role for the government as intelligencers. Right, yeah, sorry. So an excavation of the contents and the material forms of those letters show us that 14 of the most 15 similar figures to Bizzari also sent intelligence reports to the Tudor government. And now I'm just on the same slide again. Sorry, this is what happens when you give a talk at 9 p.m. at night.
Not to worry.
Sorry, I cut a slide from here and I was expecting to see it. So the case of these intelligences allows us to see how we can move from distant to close reading to see patterns and commonalities. And this is a process that invites iteration. So I think iteration is a very crucial way in which we develop our computational approaches to literary history so that we can finesse them alongside the humanistic questions that we're posing. And that first look we have at our data is often very coarse-grained and means jettisoning information, and it has that kind of heuristic quality. And we see that with our work on itineraries. So we've been able to reconstruct kind of rough-hewn itineraries thanks to the work of Lotte and Josie in geocoding our place data. So what we have here is an example. So this is an overview of Erasmus's Correspondence. What you see in the big red dots are the places from which he wrote. The blue dots are the places, they're much smaller, you can just see them very small, are the places from which he received letters. And the red lines connecting those red dots infer an itinerary. So we know there's missing data because we don't have every place that he traveled to, only the places from which he wrote. But it allows us to begin to see his movements and to infer the kinds of movement he did in the work he was doing, setting up a trilingual college in Louvain and undertaking journeys to oversee the printing of his works. And it also allows us to compare the kinds of movements undertaken by different kinds of figures in our archive. So we might want to compare Thomas Cromwell's kind of geographic footprint with that of Lord Burleigh. So they're both secretaries of state, but you can see very clearly that Cromwell has a much broader reach in terms of his spread across Europe and in fact beyond into the New World. And secretaries of state, by comparison, have a very different kind of geographic profile from diplomats who have a very itinerant profile. And this is an example of Thomas Smith's movements. They just look very different, and it allows us to make these very kind of very basic comparisons, but ones which are very helpful to understand the shape of the archive with which we're working and its making. So this mesoscale view invites questions that could take us to iterations either further at the macro or micro scales. An example of a macro scale question is, who was in the same place at the same time? So let us consider two individuals who wrote letters from different locations on subsequent dates. We can thus construct two itineraries. And we can see that they're in itineraries intersected on the 22nd of April. Using this idea, we can scale it up. We developed a method that could find all the intersections across the whole archive of people who were in the same place at the same moment. But what this means is that you get a lot of data. So what you get in it from a list of intersections is a way of showing a potential local network of people who may have interacted with another, but this needs to be validated in some way. So if two people's itineraries overlap, we can also see whether they wrote to one another, whether that was before or after their intersection. And in fact, we can do another piece of analysis which tells us whether they mention one another. In the process of preparing our data for this work, we kind of cleaned all the names. So what we have as a result is a disambiguated name list. So for every person, we have alternate names by which they were known, and we can then search the descriptions of the contents of the letters to see if they spoke about one another. This has been quite useful for verifying whether people were likely to have actually interacted in that place. The results of such queries of a data set of 130,000 letters, however, is vast. So we created a further iteration because we were interested in understanding people who were in the same place, never wrote to one another, but may have interacted in an important way. So to do this, we calculate a statistical estimate of the likelihood that two people were in the same place by chance. So we might think about this. It's very much less likely that two people who are in London on the same date interacted than two people who happened to be in a very small Welsh village on the same day. So we want to understand the rareness of people being in that location across our whole data set compared with the number of intersections that actually happened there. And this allows us to rank every single interaction by its likelihood. And by starting with the least likely, we think that those are more likely to be historically significant and be meaningful that these two people were in the same place at the same time. And indeed, it's actually a very useful heuristic for getting at those kinds of historically significant interactions. So what do we find in that ranked list? We find lots of wars and sieges, people who were unlikely to be in the same place, but were in this very small French village because they were having a battle there. And we actually have a lot of cases that are to do with the dissolution of the monasteries, that people in small Welsh villages because they were there to examine the monastery that was there. The other thing it allows us to do is reconstruct narratives. So one example of many is the case of Seth Cox and Christopher Perkins in Prague and Krakow in the 1590s. So these men never wrote to one another. Why are they in Eastern Europe on the same day? Well, they didn't write to one another, but it seems that Perkins was there on official embassy sent by the British government. Cox, however, is a figure about whom almost nothing is known. Even the history of his family is so scant in detail that the only thing we know about him is that he died fighting in the Irish Wars in 1599. However, a reading of his letters suggests that he was actually an agent working for the government sent to verify the official diplomatic reports. And in fact, on both occasions, his reports about Perkins' skill as a negotiator are far from complimentary. Is quite brutal in his assessment of his skills. So once again, then we can see how a broad ranging query leads us ultimately to a close reading of a set of letters. The example of Cox is useful because it shows us the ways that iteration between scales of analysis can offer different things for different disciplines that are represented in a collaboration, and in turn may offer themselves to different publication venues. So this is about the paths taken. That movement between scales of reading opens up almost endless possibilities, and our project and forthcoming book undertook a set of experiments and chose a very specific set of paths through that data, articulating sort of broad trends, and then using the data to find those little case studies that weave their way through the data. But there are necessarily almost endless other routes that could be chosen. at a range of different scales. And for this reason, I think it's really important that we make the data and code available to others so that people can take this work in new directions and find completely other paths through that data. And we can imagine that those more historically inclined may wish to use the data to excavate those kind of very close narratives, those kind of, do that kind of archival digging, like the example of Cox and Perkins. But other opportunities present themselves through the identification of local commonalities. And here we think about that kind of mesoscale analysis, those collective biographies, such as the example of the intelligences. In and of themselves, these men have hardly been given any attention in scholarship. But when you consider them as a collective, they suddenly take on much more significance. They become, they become a kind of category of people that are very revealing about the strategies of foreign intelligence gathering of the Tudor government. And similarly, there's a path we haven't taken yet, and that's kind of making arguments at scale. And here we might think about the kinds of work that some people do with cultural heritage data that ends up in journals like Science or Nature, these kind of very large scale arguments. And so something could be said about the broad scale trends and communication patterns in early modern England. But something we haven't done is zoom further out still by positioning this already large data set within a broader context. So one of the ways of iterating is shifting to take additional images from different altitudes, using that metaphor we started with. So working with it when a data set, our choice is normally only to zoom closer in, to get closer to the ground. But another option is panning wider by taking in more data. So cultural heritage and many humanities data sets are circumscribed naturally by the numerous historic forces. So the case of letters is particularly instructive. For example, the letter by design is a technology of dispersal. Letters will be sent out, many will be lost to the vicissitudes of time. If they landed in the personal archives of another important person, they may have a greater chance of survival, but necessarily their oeuvre will end up spread across different collections. So that issue of dispersal has been tackled at the level of the individual so far. So it's the very first step of working on projects like the collected correspondence of X. And this has been the kind of, life work of many scholars that's been kind of pulling together back those scattered letters into an edited volume. But how can we go further by reamassing letters at scale? And what if we situated the state papers within that collection? So this is the aim of the second project I'm discussing today, Networking Archives. The fantastic team are shown at the bottom of the screen. And the aim of this project was to construct a meta-archive, digitally connecting 3 data sets, which encompass over 100 collections and catalogues between them, and create a new data set of 450,000 letters. So as well as releasing this data set as a data paper, we're conducting research on it that's being published by articles, a collaboratively authored book with accompanying code repo and exploratory visualizations, and a journal special issue. So busy. So the 2 data sets come from very different origins. So the first is an expanded version of the state paper. So the period that we covered in the previous project, but then taken up to 1714. And then we're combining that with a union catalogue known as Early Modern Letters Online. So this is a project that was started by Howard Hodson, and it's a digital union catalogue created for studying the Republic of Letters, this kind of intellectual network of the early modern period. So the online resource, Early Modern Letters Online, has brought together so far about 100 catalogues. And this is a tree map visualization of its makeup, showing that the biggest constituency of all is the Bodleian card catalogue, but it also includes collected correspondence of people like Samuel Hartlib, Johann de Witt, Gerardus Vossius. It's about 125,000 letters, and it's just a partial representation of the Republic of Letters because catalogues are incomplete. Some key movers and shakers are not represented because not all scholars are keen to share their data, even their metadata. But it's a very useful resource for bringing together with the state papers. So IMLO is a set of overlapping ego networks, effectively. It's like the collected works of Johann de Witt times 99. And we've brought those all together. But what's interesting is when we do that basic first analysis that we often do when we get a data set that's a network, looking at the degree distribution, we see that it looks really similar to the state papers. We're seeing that diagonal line that we saw again in that second slide or third slide that I had earlier today. What it means is that at any scale, we're seeing the same pattern of very many poorly connected people and one or two very well connected people. And this is because though we think about the state papers as a kind of national archive, it is in fact a series of overlapping ego networks as well. Neil Johnston, who is the head of early modern records at the National Archives, where the majority of these papers are held, expressed it to me as follows. He said, the state papers is not an organic collection like the records of a court of law. The state papers are an artificial creation of my predecessors, much like IMLO. They are the kind of creation of a kind of process of cataloguing, and that goes back to the very creation of it being the working papers of the principal secretary. So it's a series of principal secretaries' ego networks overlaying over one another. But thinking about them just being a set of overlaid ego networks, people get the sense that so much is missing. And so they say, oh, you only get this kind of scale-free redistribution, this kind of, all of these poorly connected people, because your archive is so incomplete. The data's missing, that's why it looks like that. We thought to think a little bit more systematically about this, because I would argue that all data-driven research is essentially studying the result of a specific data collection process. And indeed, all data sets are incomplete in some way. What we have essentially is a way of describing the archival history of the state papers, not early modern government correspondence per se. But this doesn't mean that we can't reveal important things about early modern communication, but we need to be really rigorous about how sure we are of our results. And one way we can do that is to actually test how robust the network is to loss. So how much is missing data affecting our results? That was our question. So two people on our team, Jan and Sebastian, did a very systematic analysis of the effect of missing data. They essentially tried to reverse engineer the loss of data by destroying more. Obviously, they didn't actually destroy letters, but we kind of synthesized the loss of additional letters, randomly removing samples of letters and comparing the network metrics across the original and the sampled data sets. And what we saw is that all our data sets are remarkably robust to letter removal. We see that we used a method called Pearson correlation to see like how similar the results are. And we saw that even with 60 to 70% of the letters removed, almost all the metrics remained the same. At the point of 60 to 70%, it kind of dropped off very violently, which is why you see that kind of particular curve. But with almost 60 to 70%, they remained very robust. We then also, we think that part of the reason of that is due to the shape of our data set. So we already know we have that heavy skew towards a small number of highly connected nodes. So it means that if you knock them out, there is a drastic impact. But the most people who are poorly connected, knocking them out doesn't have a very big result. But it also suggests you need to be more cautious interpreting results for those lowest connected nodes, those further down the rankings. They also tested some potential historical sources of missing or incorrect data. So the kinds of loss that might happen historically, where you might miss you might lose an entire catalogue, or you might lose a specific set of set of gatherings within a folio, or you might lose a specific year. So we tried randomly knocking those out as well. And we found that some measurements showed more variability with certain kinds of removal. There's one called eigenvector centrality, which measures a node's centrality through its connections to other well-connected nodes. And we found that that responded quite poorly. And this is probably due in part to the distribution of those catalogue sizes. If you remember that tree map I showed, where some of the catalogues are very large, it means if you knock out one of those, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on the network. Okay, so not having all the data isn't necessarily a problem. And connecting data, even when there's lots lost, can have really huge benefits. So what this work shows is that while reconnecting a lot of overlapping eager networks will mean lots of absences, there is reason to be hopeful. And this is especially true when we're creating new connections across different catalogues and archives. And particularly, it's the value of connecting archives that are normally studied by different communities. So one of our data sets was collected in England, the other one captures catalogues from Europe, one is about government business, the other is about intellectual communities of thinkers. So what's the point of bringing them together? Well, we know that there is some crossover between these communities, even though they're studied by different communities of scholars. We know that intellectuals were also diplomats, intelligences or correspondents of those figures. For example, Samuel Hartlib is typically listed alongside those intellectuals like Mersenne, Kircher and Oldenburg as the key figures of the 17th century Republic of Letters. But his parliamentary pension was granted because he was an intelligencer. He, in regard of the intelligence and correspondence maintained by them abroad on behalf of the Protectorate. And what we see here is an image produced by Jan Ryan on our project. And it's particularly powerful because it's not showing the expanded correspondence network, but in fact, the network of catalogues. Catalogues have connections between them if they share people. And what we see is obviously a very strong connection between the Tudor State Papers and the Stuart State Papers. But we also see a very strong connection with the Bodleian Card Catalogue. And that's because this essentially is that library in Oxford ended up holding a lot of papers that should have been in the state papers. But actually these lines going across show us that the members of the community represented in the state papers are densely connected with the Republic of Letters. So there's a lot to be excavated here, and we've only begun to kind of scratch the surface of what is possible. This work is also suggestive of the bigger initiatives needed and already underway to challenge cultural heritage data silos. In the UK, we've got initiatives like the one called Towards a National Collection, and in Europe there's Europeana, which are beginning to imagine this kind of utopian future where we're able to connect entities across different catalogues and collections. We can imagine a future where, you know, you can search a person and find everything pertaining to them across all libraries and galleries and museums in the whole of Britain or Europe or beyond, or be able to query and say, please show me every document written from this place on this date. This would be a very powerful way of leveraging our data. But I think the power is more at those kind of intersections. There's people who have been peripheral to one archive, but suddenly by connecting archives, you suddenly see them emerge into significance, because at the peripheries of many, they are at the center of those intersections. And I think that's something that we're yet to see, people whose histories have been so far obscured by their archives being scattered in many different places. However, absence remains a problem. This work has to be coupled with a commitment to understand the ways in which digitized content is representative or not of the archive as it existed or existed in the past, and what is missing. And this is one of the things that we've been thinking about on the final project I want to speak about today, Living with Machines. So Living with Machines is a project that aims to facilitate new historical findings about the effects of mechanization on the lives of ordinary people in the long 19th century. And we're doing that through marshalling pre-digitized collections, newspapers, maps, census returns, books, and journals. We want to develop models, tools, code, and infrastructure that can be used not just by us, but by other projects in the future. And we're undertaking that through a kind of radical form of collaboration, which brings together data scientists, historians, library professionals and curators, computational linguists, digital humanists, an urban geographer, visualization specialist. We need a whole slide for the team. There's currently 28 members, but there have been more in the past. And we wanted to create something that's kind of greater than the sum of the disciplinary parts. A good example of the interdisciplinary collaboration can be seen in our research into the 19th century language of machinery. So why are we interested in this? So historians of technology have argued that by 1900, our frameworks of thought about the relationship of humans to machines became set like a kind of conceptual or linguistic concrete in ways that continue to structure today's discussions of technology. Our discourse encourages us to imagine machines as capable of acting, doing, and even learning by themselves. That has a legacy today. Artificial intelligence is kind of the end game of that imaginary world. Our project wanted to discover things both methodological and intellectual. We wanted to know, how can we find animate machines in texts? What are common features and tendencies of this form of language, its tropes and figures? Is there a change over time and place, and are there generic patterns that we can observe? So beginning with the method, we wanted to identify sentences in a large corpora, specifically the British Library Books Corpus, which is 60,000 19th century books. We wanted to see how we could find places where a machine is mentioned in ways that you would normally expect a text to be speaking about a person. And we thought that meant that there was kind of some animacy or agency being assigned to the machine. So we thought a language model might help us, but we found that language models performed extremely badly because they're normally trained on the target word. So we developed an innovative new method where we masked the word. So we hid the word machine from the language model, and we got it to predict. We got it to predict what word it expected to find there. And if it didn't predict machine, but instead predicted things like girl, man, boy, woman, or prince, we thought that the text was doing something where it was anthropomorphizing the machine. This was actually a very effective method. We did this on essentially we're trying to surprise the machine, if you think about it. So we're anthropomorphizing the machine here, but we wanted to find ways of navigating the output of this model. How could we then tell an interesting story about the animacy of machines? So it spits out thousands of predictions about where the model was surprised. And we can rank them by their surprisingness and start close reading. And this tells us quite a lot. But it kind of is a very longhand way of doing things, and you can't see those kind of latent patterns. So what we decided to do was then cluster the results by the type of predicted word. So we could cluster together all the words that were machine words. We could cluster together all the words that were transport words, that were workforce words, energy words, words about children, about female words, and about slaves. And this one is particularly interesting. The slave predictions are a very powerful and horrifying way of showing the linguistic norms and prejudices found across 19th century texts. So on this slide, we can see 3 sentences where the original word machine is masked and the model predicted slave in its place. The fact the word slave potentially makes sense in those locations tells us something both about 19th century cultural assumptions about mechanization of labor and the attitudes to slavery. the word slave seemed more likely in quote 1 than the word machine tells us that across the corpus, the man-slave binary opposition is more common than man-machine. And we can begin to see why the model seems to see slave as an apparent synonym for machine in quotations 2 and 3. These show contexts where agency or positive attributes such as will, ambition, and responsibility are stripped from a person. The most common analogy here is not machine, but a slave. So while the language model is wrong in these specific cases, it is in fact on the right lines. It's reflecting a culture in which enslaved people were seen as less than human and equivalent to machines in the hands of those in power. And the method therefore helps uncover the prejudices of a corpus. At 60,000 books, we can perhaps posit this as a meaningful proxy for wider cultural attitudes. That word proxy, however, it brings another key topic on the project. Our analysis of the shape of data sets themselves and the extent to which we can say that a large corpus is representative. I think I'm running a bit slow here. I'm going to try and speed up. So one of the anxieties in the DH community is that the contours of digitized archives are shaping scholarly arguments in unforeseen ways. Ian Milligan's written about this in his recent book. We want to know if the sample is actually representative of the entire population. So we, on the project, we have a massive archive of newspapers. We have 40 million pages, but it's actually less than 9% of the physical holdings of the British Library. And those, you know, those are not all newspapers that existed in the 19th century. We wanted to determine how representative our digitized corpora are. So we've got this method called the environmental scan. And we did this, we found a proxy for all of the newspapers that existed by finding a newspaper press directory. We could then match the titles in our digitized sample, our 40,000 pages, with all of the titles that existed that were advertised in this newspaper press directory. So we can see, you know, which titles are represented. We also then have all this wonderful contextual information, because we can say that, as you can see here in purple, this was a conservative leaning newspaper, that it was published daily or weekly, for what price. And we then have all of these different facets that we can sort our results on to show how representative our corpus is against all of these different facets. And what we were actually able to show is that the JISC corpus, which is a subset of our biggest corpus of newspapers, it overrepresents conservative newspapers, and it vastly underrepresents independent and neutral newspapers, which is really important. When we have our results of our analysis, we can actually see how far they might be skewed by that overrepresentation of conservative voices, for example. We're doing this kind of environmental scan work with other holdings. So we've done visualization work on our maps holdings to show actually how much of the coverage of National Library of Scotland we have of the Ordnance Survey maps that they have in their holdings, what we don't have. But also it allows us to see the coverage of the surveying process in that map making process and how it evolved over time, which is a very useful tool. We developed another method of distant reading, or rather distant viewing our maps on the project as well. So in a work package led by Katie McDonough and Kazra Hassani, we've developed something called Map Reader, which is a kind of pipeline where we can do this. We can take a map, we can tile it, and then we can use humans to annotate those tiles with features that we're interested in. So we were interested in, is there any rail in this tile? And then we can use that as a training set so that the computer vision machine learning algorithm can then learn what rail looks like and predict it on other maps so that we don't have to read them all ourselves. And it can output this in this red, we can see, oh, wait, look, it's been able to draw for us the rail infrastructure in the 19th century at the times at which the maps surveyed the country. We can then look at correlation with other features such as urban areas. So in black, we've got, are there buildings in this tile? And the the model has predicted where there are buildings. We can see those correlations. I should say this tool has applications outside just reading maps. It's actually been adopted elsewhere in the Alan Turing Institute to look at plant phenotyping. So it has applications for other kind of visual sources, which is really great to actually see that opposite trajectory of methods coming from the arts and humanities and going into the sciences. Because scientists love thinking that they're going to save the humanities. And we're also able to link this data. So this is, we can see kind of correlations between the rail infrastructure. We're really interested in understanding actually what rail brought to an area, how it affected people's lives. So what we've got here is a kind of heat map of roads from another data set that we've created on the location of stations. It shows the distance of roads from the station. And then we can then connect that to census data to say, actually, how did it affect people's lives? Can we see patterns in the kinds of people living in those locations? So we can say, how big were the households that lived close to stations versus far from stations? Or we can ask things also like, which households had servants, depending on their distance from a station? And what we find is this actually varies depending on whether it's an urban or a rural area. So, for example, this graph here shows that in urban areas, the mean number of live-in servants per household was highest close to stations, under 250 meters, which then fell very sharply across distance bands between 250 meters and 1 kilometer before rising again after 2 kilometers. By contrast, in rural parishes, the mean number of servants is at its lowest close to stations, rising fairly consistently after the first 2.5 kilometers. So these are kinds of questions when you can link images of rail infrastructure to geolocated stations, to street data, to census data. And I think that is the next potential that we have in this field. So this final example from these collaborative projects suggests how we might need to complicate the archaeology metaphor that I started with. I think that archaeology metaphor works really neatly for single document types that I was discussing in relation to Tudor networks of power and networking archives, as we adopted different views in relation to that data type, zooming in and also out to integrate multiple sources of data. It works really well also for the work on environmental scans and map reader, that kind of archaeology metaphor. It is a kind of distant reading and allows us to ask those questions of individual texts or individual maps. But the beyond the tracks work, where we're linking data sources, takes us to a different kind of work. It's not just aerial photography, it's bringing in other kinds of data about terrain. And I would therefore argue that the next generation of digital projects needs not only to move between scales of analysis, but also dimensions of analysis. However, while the research looks cool, this is the tip of a labor iceberg. To facilitate this kind of work, it requires investment in the development of human and technical infrastructures. In other words, we need not only to develop tools for linking data that work across projects, but also a community of users able to apply those and share lessons between projects and initiatives. And that answer I pose of technology and collaborators can also be complicated. The kinds of work I've shown today, the process and pipelines, show that DH scholars might productively collaborate with machines to allow algorithms and neural networks to actually do some of the thinking for us. So one of the most basic and frequently made arguments in that direction is about the pragmatics of scale, that we can offload simple tasks such as classification and automation. But I think these projects show the ways in which we can deploy algorithms and machine learning to help us interrogate our scholarly processes. By providing us with heuristics, computational outcomes actively welcome the kind of iterative development that's been at the heart of my talk today. These don't just force us to hone our research questions, but also to develop better queries and to add annotations to the data that we can input to models to optimize them. We can move forward different fields simultaneously then, but the optimization of models, the aim of most data scientists, can sometimes overshadow the perhaps more valuable kinds of thinking for humanistic inquiry that are rendered possible when working with machines. A small group of scholars are beginning to realize that when we engage with results that look like algorithmic failure or miscategorization, where machines are fools, we're able to bring to light the conceptual borderlands, the fuzzy boundaries between our human constructed categories and labels, such as the relationship between human and machine, which I discussed in the relationship of our language work on living with machines, or that grey scale of similarity between diplomats, intelligences, spies, and double agents, which I explored in relation to Tudor networks of power. In this way, machines can act as mirrors to culture, in which we can examine the assumptions and biases that we find in the text that we read and the frameworks of thought that we bring to bear on them. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruth. So I, of course, have many questions or excited follow-on, but for those who are able to put questions in either Q&A or chat, please go for it. And I've got one from Diana. Travis, shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, I'm happy. You're a bit choppy right now, so I'll take over for you if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm gonna read Diana's question here to you, Ruth. Diana says, you mentioned labor at the end. It seems that to get this aerial view requires some baseline level of somewhat detailed description knowledge, metadata, and essentially item level description of documents and individuals referenced in them. Can you talk about whether the Tudor documents were previously described and to what degree and were digitized over how many years among how many repositories, institutions? Do the state papers exist in a single institution or do they draw from multiple other institutions, ellipses, or whether any of the pre-description work was part of the project?
That's great. Yeah, sorry that because I like mushed together so many projects, I kind of gave them a much more kind of superficial description. The state papers are kind of they are a kind of product of a cataloging process. So they're catalogued in the 19th century and they are across multiple institutions. Most of them are in the National Archives. The original organization was destroyed by the cataloging process. They wanted to calendar them in order. So the original filing process they were in before was destroyed in the process of recalendering them. They're physically very fragile. So they were microfilms a few decades ago, and those have been the basis of the digitization. And what State Papers Online does is it brings together the catalog descriptions, which are kind of a paraphrase the contents of the letters, and the scans. Some of them are rescanned with nice modern rescans, but a lot of them are just scans of the microfilm, and then it adds metadata to it. So essentially, like there's all this layer of labor. It's like the original people who filed these in the 16th century, then the catalogers in the 19th century, then the people microfilming, then the people who are entering metadata for this project. So we're kind of sitting atop all of this labor, and it's really important to credit all of that.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to read.
Sorry, it was such a brief. I've written a whole chapter.
No, of course. I thought that was a wonderful answer to that question. I'm going to read, I think Katrina has a two-part question, so I'll read the first part to you. I was wondering if you could reflect on how we can go about prioritizing sources for deriving data, given the extreme backlog confronting the process of creating linked data. You mentioned clues to what may be historically significant. For example, in improbability of connections. Can we anticipate these kinds of clues before we start the process of digitizing and creating linked data?
Sorry, I'm just rereading it because it's such a good question, but I don't process very well when I hear things. Yeah. I think we have to kind of future-proof our data when we're we just need to be giving people unique identifiers that are kind of linked to, I mean, there are all of these ways of producing unique resource identifiers, that there needs to be a process in which people kind of bake that in at the outset. I mean, we're not going to have a perfect way of doing it. We're going to kind of roughly match things up as we go, and people will be able to hone it later. But I wonder, so one of the things we've been doing on living machines is doing this environmental scan work, where we worked out what had been digitized and how overrepresentative or underrepresentative it was of certain political leanings. We've been able to do some additional digitization in response to that to try and rebalance things. But I think rebalancing is a really hard thing to do, because you could try and rebalance it to make it as representative of the balance that was in the past, but that might leave marginalized voices still very still very marginalized. So we have the chance also just to amplify the marginalized, say, actually, this, this category of voice or newspaper or was very underrepresented at the time. If we kind of produce a representative sample, it will be even smaller. If our role as curators or historians is to recenter the marginalized, we might want to think about digitizing in other ways. So, but you need to do that kind of survey work to understand that in the first place. And as we know, most digitization has gone in a really ad hoc process, because it's been, been directed by a wealthy donor and then by a project that wanted to digitize this very specific thing because these people wanted to study this thing. So it's come at all these different angles, and we've got this patchwork. And so I think that's a particular area we need to do much more work on, is doing that kind of survey work, finding contextual data sets to understand what should be there and isn't, or how the digitized corporate are kind of amplifying inequalities in who is represented.
So I'm going to hop to one of the Q&A questions before we do Katrina's second question, and that's coming from Jason in the Q&A. Ruth, I'm assuming you can see this as well, but I'll read it to you. Jason asks, or first he says that it's a fascinating talk. He asks, are the combined collections that you're drawing from static or dynamic, or are there accessions occurring in those collections that need to be accounted for in your model?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the letters, the state papers, I think the state papers are static. Just because these big companies don't really like to do much more work. They just like to make money off work they've done in the past. Early modern letters online is constantly growing. So when we do our analysis, we have to say our analysis was done on the version that was archived at this date. So version control is really, really important. And similarly with the British newspaper archive that we're working on in Living Machines, we are working on the version that was sent to us by Find My Past on X date. So, having version control is just the only way we can work. We're working on a static version. We haven't found a way of modeling an evolving collection. Yeah. But there's no reason you couldn't just take the methods. You can take the methods and apply them to, but you're not going to get the same results. So it's really important to have that. If you want to get the same results as us, you're going to need to use that particular version.
Yeah, for sure. So Jason has a follow-up that I think echoes what you've been talking about. And he asks, what is your level of certainty that the combined universe of collections you are drawing from represent the universe of documents you are targeting? Are there unknown unknowns out there? For example, collections you are not currently aware of that may have documents of interest?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think with letters, it's just so unknown because of the kind of really piecemeal way that you are kind of hooking up these people's personal archives that we don't know how big those gaps are. I mean, that kind of reverse engineering of destruction is helpful, because it makes us feel a little bit more confident about that we're still capturing the people at that kind of overrepresented end of things. But with newspapers, I think when we can get these kind of contextual data sets, and I think there's much more work for scholars to be doing with people who work in cultural heritage organizations, because I think historians don't understand this kind of wealth of untapped knowledge about all of these kind of contextual, catalogs are an amazing source of data, but also there are all these kinds of texts that are no longer studied because they are kind of like directories of roads, or all of these kinds of things that allow us to contextualize our knowledge in important ways. So I see that as a really exciting area to move into. But I think there you're moving much more into the present day. So 19th century, that kind of impulse to document is really helpful.
Great. And trying to be cognizant of your time, knowing that it's 10:10 or something like that here, right? Maybe we'll have, unless somebody has a really pressing question, we'll sort of have Victoria's question be the last one. And she asks what she says is a fairly basic question. And that's what pieces of metadata are most commonly used to link data sets. Yeah.
Perfect. I mean, here, we're just using people and places because it's really easy, but I think it's a really good place to start. Date is another, right? But the place is easier. There are a finite number of places on our globe. But the people, it is hard. I've done a lot of kind of assisted manual cleaning and linking of data sets. And we've produced some nice tools on the project where we've kind of found candidates that we can then kind of manually select. So it does like candidate pre-selection for us. Yeah, it's just I think it's just a really great way of starting to connect across archives. And you can already see, even with just those two places and people, we go into a whole different universe of possibility.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I don't know if you all can hear me okay at this stage. My internet seems to be over it. But yes, thank you again so much, and thanks folks for coming. This has been recorded and we'll be making it available on the Cafe Events website in due course. Big round of applause.
Thanks so much for bearing with a very tired person.
Oh, no, you're wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Bye, folks.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for coming.